Oh, hi! Today I'll be going through some vegan protein sources by protein percentage on a calorie basis. You probably already know a lot of them, but hopefully you'll find some new options today that might one day become a staple in your kitchen. I'll be talking about protein percentage, cost effectiveness, and how you might use these in recipes. The first up is Say Grace. It comes in at 95% protein. This is basically a very concentrated version of soy protein. I think it's a little lesser known than some of the other foods I'll be going over. It comes in around 13 to 17 grams of protein per dollar, which is a little bit pricier, but it is 95% protein. You can actually get it at a discount if you do a subscription. As I'm sure you've already surmised, you can get it in a lot of different shapes and sizes, bits, shreds, nuggets, fillets. You do have to rehydrate it before using it. I typically will rehydrate it in boiling water for about 10 minutes. Then I run cold water over it until you can touch it with your hands. Then squeeze out all of the water. I do this part by hand. And then I will usually either throw it on a pan for like 10 minutes or so to brown up the outside, or just toss it in an air fryer. I think this gives it kind of a nice crispy texture. It also absorbs flavors really well, so if you throw it in broth or seasoning, it will soak up all of those flavors. I personally usually just toss it in barbecue sauce or teriyaki sauce. I recently made this barbecue mac and cheese with the bits, and it was really good. If you're thinking of TVP, which is probably the closest texture to it, it's a little bit more dense and a little more chewy than what you would expect with TVP, or even soy curls. Next up are vegan protein powders. This is the item on the list that tends to vary the most on protein percentage and also pricing. Typically, your single source proteins or protein isolates will be higher percentage protein. As you can see on the list, Eat Just mung bean protein powder comes in around 90% protein. It is pretty expensive though. Then you have pea protein, soy protein, brown rice, and seed protein, and those are actually all around 80% or a little bit higher protein and a little more cost effective as well. Now, the single source proteins would probably be used for baking or making your own protein powder, but you wouldn't typically just drink this straight up in a shake with water or milk because they don't really have flavor. Speaking of flavor, you also have your ready-to-drink protein powders like Ghost, Earth Chimp, Veg, Orgain. These are the ones that are already pre-flavored, and you just kind of add them to water or milk of your choice. You can also add them to smoothies. These tend to be between like 45 to 65% protein on a calorie basis. The cost is also significantly more than your single source proteins, but they do taste good enough that you can just drink them and you don't have to add additional ingredients. Also, a lot of the blended ones that you would drink in a shake are blended so that they're a complete protein, which if that's something you're interested in, that might also be a factor in choosing which one. Next up is fava bean tofu. I had to take a picture from their website because I still have not been able to find any of this at my grocery stores. It comes in around 91% protein and is about 10 grams of protein per US dollar. This is a little on the pricey side, but if you have a soy allergy, this could be a really good option for you. My understanding, since I haven't been able to use it yet, is that you would use it the same way you would extra firm or super firm tofu. Next up is TPP, or textured pea protein. It's 84% protein, 11 grams of protein per US dollar. This is basically just a soy-free version of TVP, so you can use this exactly the same way that you would TVP. And I'll be going over all the ways you might use TVP later in the video. If you're enjoying this video and like to see more like it, be sure to like and subscribe. Vital wheat gluten is one of my personal favorites and is basically just a high protein powder made from wheat. So if you're gluten-free, I would stay away from this one. It's 75 to 80% protein depending on which brand you buy, and you can usually get it for about 50 to 60 grams of protein per dollar. Even if you're not super familiar with Vital wheat gluten, you've probably had or at least heard of seitan, and this is what it's made out of. Vital wheat gluten is personally one of my favorite things to experiment with, so I do a lot more with it than just seitan. For instance, I will make bready recipes with it, such as high-protein bread, high-protein pizza dough, and high-protein pretzel bites, but I also like it for high-protein desserts. Some of my favorites are banana bread, pumpkin bread, and a chocolate sandwich cookie. Edamame puffs are something I discovered a couple of years ago. They're a little bit harder to find because only one brand makes them in the US, Smart for Life, but they are 80% protein and about 26 grams of protein per US dollar. I like to use them to make high-protein Rice Krispie treats. They're also great for making homemade protein bars, high-protein granola, or even just sprinkling on top of a smoothie bowl or salad for some extra crunch. I personally think of them like a crunchier version of puffed rice, so I would just recommend using them any way you would use puffed rice. Next up is TVP, textured vegetable protein. For this one, I'm specifically talking about the small granules like the ones you see with Anthony's or Bob's Red Mill. This comes in at 60 to 70% protein depending on which brand you buy. The cost varies pretty drastically on this one. You can get 24 to 51 grams of protein per dollar. I would highly recommend buying in bulk if this is a product you're going to use often. Bob's Red Mill actually sells a 25-pound bag, and that is significantly cheaper. You can also find cheaper options at Asian grocery stores. TVP is most typically used as kind of like a ground beef substitute, so you can use it in tacos, shepherd's pie, high-protein bacon bits, enchiladas, pasta, chili, and a ton of other things. If you're using it in one of these ways, you'll probably rehydrate it, add spices, and then cook it down to the desired moisture level. Another way that I like to use TVP to add extra protein is to use it where I might normally use a grain, either rice, quinoa, or breadcrumbs. For instance, I would normally stuff mushrooms with breadcrumbs probably. Instead, I'll just use TVP. And for this, you don't even have to rehydrate your TVP. Sometimes I like to roll chunks of TVP around in a TVP and panko mixture, and you can't really tell the difference between the TVP and the panko. I also like to use it as a breadcrumb topping on casserole dishes like mac and cheese. I like to use TVP as a rice substitute as a way to add protein. So if I'm making a curry and I want some added protein, I'll use TVP instead of rice as the base. Or if I'm making a fajita bowl like this one, I would use seasoned TVP instead of seasoned rice. And now on to the potentially more controversial uses of TVP. I really like to use it in baked goods. You can use it in muffins, cookies, pie crusts. You can make your own granola bars. You can use it as a topping on berry crumbles. I personally use it the same way I would oats, so I also use it in my oatmeal or in my baked oats recipes. I usually do like a 50-50 split, 50% TVP and 50% oats. Soy flour is next. This specific brand is 70% protein and 14 grams of protein per dollar. I like to use it as a high protein flour substitute in baking. Specifically, I make fudgy brownies with it, and I also make a high protein pizza crust with it. It is significantly more dense than regular flour, so keep this in mind when you're substituting it in your baking. I would probably only use it for something that's already kind of dense, which is why I think it works well with brownies. Pea protein crisps are basically the soy-free version of edamame puffs. They're 60% protein and 11 grams of protein per dollar, which is a little more expensive than edamame puffs, but they are soy-free. So you'd basically use these in the same way you would edamame puffs, which would be like high-protein Rice Krispie treats or protein bars. Now for what you've actually been waiting for, tofu. Let's start with Silken tofu. It's a lesser-known tofu than some of the other tofus. Basically, it's made very similar to the other types of tofu, except the milk is not coagulated, which is what gives it its very silky and smooth texture. Silken tofu ranges between 40 and 56% protein and about 9 to 10 grams of protein per US dollar. There are basically two types. There's a refrigerated version of Silken tofu that you can find in the grocery stores, usually by your other tofu options, but there's also a shelf-stable variety of Silken tofu, which tends to be my favorite because my grocery stores don't always have Silken tofu. I prefer the Mori New brand, and I usually get their extra firm Silken tofu, which sits at 56% protein. Because Silken tofu has such a smooth texture, there's actually a lot of stuff you can do with Silken tofu that you might not really do with like firm or extra firm tofu. I pretty much add Silken tofu to any recipe that's already creamy. It's great for dessert recipes like puddings and mousses, creamy pies and cheesecakes, and it also works really well blended as an egg replacer in things like brownies. It's also great for making high protein, creamy, cheesy sauces. I like to use it for Alfredo or mac and cheese sauce. It makes a really good stretchy soy mozzarella that's great on pizzas. I use it to make a high protein condensed mushroom soup, which is great for like scalloped potatoes or green bean casserole, a lot of your Thanksgiving type recipes. It's great for making high protein condiments like mayo or sour cream. If you're making a recipe that uses a bunch of mayo or sour cream, you can swap it with these high protein versions, and then you kind of have a high protein recipe. Some of my favorites are the 7-layer taco dip, coleslaw, and chickpea salad. Similarly, it's really great for high protein salad dressings. And lastly, I like to use it in smoothies to add creaminess, thickness, and obviously protein. You're probably most familiar with super firm or extra firm tofu. This comes in between 40 to 43% protein and is usually between 17 and 20 grams of protein per US dollar. Of course, you could probably find it cheaper, especially if you went to like an Asian market. Now, most super firm tofus are slightly more high in protein than an extra firm tofu, but the biggest difference is that they're vacuum packed, which means they've already been pre-pressed and you won't need to press it. Now, if you're buying extra firm tofu that hasn't been pressed, you will need to press it. But other than that, they are treated pretty similarly. Because it's such a firm tofu, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it. Some of the things I like to do with it are shred it with like a vegetable grater, slice it either with a vegetable peeler or a really sharp knife, crumble it by hand, cube it, or tear it into chunks, or just toss it in a food processor. Some people will actually throw the extra firm tofu in the freezer, pull it out, defrost it, and then press it, which adds a bit of a more meaty texture. There are basically two main ways to flavor extra or super firm tofu. You could either flavor it with a wet sauce. For this method, you could throw it in a marinade and let it soak up those flavors for a while, or you could just cook it with a wet sauce in a pan. Or my personal favorite is flavoring with dry spices. I usually do this with either shredded tofu or with crumbled tofu, but I basically mix the crumbled or shredded tofu in with a bunch of seasoning and spices and then toss it in the oven on a baking sheet. This method kind of allows it to cook off any excess moisture and allows it to get this really nice, dense, kind of meaty texture. You may have also seen firm tofu, which is about 40% protein. It's around 18 grams of protein per dollar. This one is less firm, obviously, than extra firm or super firm tofu. It also comes water packed, so it will need to be pressed. I tend to use this for things like dips, in which case I will be using it in a food processor, so sometimes I'll skip the pressing and just use a cheesecloth to wring out the extra water. The main thing I use firm tofu for is making my own high protein cream cheese, which I can also use in dips like seen here. I also use it as a high protein ricotta for lasagnas and stuffed shells sometimes. While we're on the subject of tofu, the last thing I wanted to cover were some soy-free tofu options. We did already talk about fava bean tofu, but there's also chickpea tofu, which is about 22% protein and 2.5 grams of protein per dollar, which is very expensive. But, if you are soy-free and you're just looking for a tofu option, this could work. There's also a pumpkin seed tofu, which comes in around 21% protein and is about 5.6 grams of protein per dollar. Also pretty pricey, but once again, if you're soy-free. Another thing to note is this is about half as much protein as the soy options. So if you're not soy-free and you can eat soy, I would probably stick with the soy options. Next is our PB Fit/PB2. Comes in around 40 to 53% protein, and you get about 21 to 36 grams of protein per US dollar. PB Fit tends to be a bit higher protein, but if you want to save some money and still have a higher protein option, Anthony's and Micro Ingredients makes a peanut powder that is pretty much the same, it just doesn't have the fancy label. PB2 also has an almond and cashew powder option. They are slightly less protein and I think a little bit more expensive, but they do exist. I like to use these in smoothies, oatmeal, and I also bake with them pretty often. I think one of the first ingredients I learned about when going vegan was nutritional yeast, which is 50 to 53% protein, which I don't think most people know. It's also 11 to 15 grams of protein per dollar, which is actually not super expensive, seeing as how it's usually just used as a flavor adder. It adds a cheesy, savory umami flavor, which makes it great for making your own cheese sauces, pasta sauces, or really anything you want to taste like cheese. You can get it a little cheaper if you buy in bulk. Also, another interesting thing to note about nutritional yeast is that they make a fortified and a non-fortified version. The fortified version is fortified with B vitamins like vitamin B12, which vegans need. Getting into protein pastas, these vary quite a bit, anywhere from 25 to 53% protein and 10 to 30 grams of protein per US dollar. What they're made out of can also vary pretty drastically. Some are edamame, soybean, black bean, lupini, chickpea. One of the most popular ones is red lentil pasta. There are also blends. I think most of the Barilla protein pasta options actually have a blend of different ingredients. Depending on which one you get, this can be a pretty good, cost-effective option to get some more protein into your diet. You might have to play around with a couple of different types to figure out which kind you actually like. I personally prefer the red lentil pasta over the others. And then in the same vein, this is something fun I found at my local grocery store. Apparently they make a rice alternative out of chickpea and red lentil. Now, I personally haven't tried these yet, so I will report back on if they're any good. Next up is tempeh. These are the only ones I have in my house, but tempeh is around 40% protein and about 13 grams of protein per US dollar. It is a little bit more expensive than tofu, but that could just be the pricing near me. Now, if you're not familiar with tempeh, it is also a soy product, but the whole food plant-based crowd tends to like this one better because it's a little bit less processed. It's made with fermented soybeans and cultured with a mold. I'm not a tempeh girly yet, but I'm willing to learn, so if you have any good tempeh recipes, send them my way. Lupini flakes, 49% protein and 14 grams of protein per dollar. Now, this is a new one that I only recently learned about on Reddit in the comment section, so I have not used it yet, but the bag says that it's great as a breadcrumb substitute or a quinoa or rice substitute. So I will let you know. Soy curls come in at 40% protein. They're between 9 and 20 grams of protein per US dollar. They also contain the whole soybean, which is different from normal TVP. They are also significantly cheaper, like almost half the price, if you buy them in bulk from the Butler website. I only recently found this out because I am pretty new to the soy curl game, but I am excited. At first I was a little intimidated, but they are actually super easy to use. You basically just soak them in water for 10 minutes, squeeze out the extra water by hand, and then toss them in the pan for like 2 to 5 minutes and add your sauce. I've been really enjoying using barbecue sauce on them. You may not think of soy milk as a protein source, but it's actually 35 to 40% protein, which is way better than any other plant-based milks. It's also between 13 and 20 grams of protein per US dollar. Funnily enough, when I was pulling all of this data, I realized I had been overpaying for soy milk because the store brand option was almost half the price of the brand name option. So if you're on a budget, that might be something you want to look at. Next up is lentils, which are 27 to 32% protein. Now the pricing on these varies pretty drastically. Let's cover dried first. When I was looking around, dried was anywhere between 22 to 83 grams of protein per US dollar. Black lentils were almost always cheaper, and red lentils were usually the most expensive. Now you could probably get it cheaper than what I'm listing if you bought in bulk. I could really only find one canned lentil option with my grocery stores, and this one came in at 19 grams of protein per dollar. Dried lentils were actually the cheapest protein source I found when digging around for data, at least on a grams of protein per dollar basis in the US. That said, if you're on a budget, dried lentils are the shit. Some of the more common ways you might use lentils are in soups, shepherd's pies, chilies, pasta sauces. Similar to lentils, beans also varied quite a bit, anywhere from 21 to 42% protein. If we're talking about dried beans, then it's about 24 to 78 grams of protein per dollar. You may even be able to find these cheaper, especially if you're buying in bulk. Canned beans come in around 18 to 30 grams per dollar. Dried beans were actually number 2 when I was collecting data for the cheapest protein sources. So if you're on a budget, I think using dried beans to help hit your protein goals would be a good option. If you're dealing more with time constraints, canned beans might be the way to go. I really like to use beans in enchiladas, quesadillas, fajita bowls, and chilies. I might take a lot of shit for this one, and I'm definitely not saying to eat peanut butter as a protein source, but if you're on a budget, you can get peanut butter for about 48 grams of protein per US dollar. It comes in around 14% protein, and it is mostly fat, so I would obviously not recommend this as a main protein source, but if you're on a tight budget, it is pretty cheap on a grams of protein per dollar basis, and you will get a lot of calories per dollar too. Low carb wraps are actually one of my holy grail items. They're about 35 to 40% protein. They are a little pricey. You get 7 to 9 grams of protein per US dollar. If this is something you can afford though, it is really kind of a lifesaver. It opens up a whole lot of other recipe options for you because your wraps have a bunch of protein and they also have a bunch of fiber. All right, now on to nuts and seeds, which are pretty similar to peanut butter. There's 6 to 20% protein and 4 to 54 grams of protein per dollar. It varies a lot depending on what you get. High level, this probably should not be a primary protein source for you because it is pretty low protein and it is a lot of fat. If you have a lot of allergies and you do need to use nuts and seeds as a protein source, I would recommend pumpkin seeds, which are about 20% protein, hemp hearts, which are about 22% protein, and then ground flax meal is actually 26% protein. If you're looking for the most affordable options in the nuts and seed category, peanuts are always going to be number one. They come in around 54 grams of protein per dollar, followed by ground flax, which is about 16 grams of protein per dollar. Chia seeds are about 16 grams of protein per dollar, and then hemp hearts, they're around 15 grams of protein per dollar, and so are sunflower seeds. There are a lot of vegetables that are actually pretty high in protein, but they are low in calories, so you'd have to eat a lot of them to really hit your protein goal with them. Some of the vegetables I like to focus on that are around 25% to 40% protein are artichoke hearts, green peas, spinach, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, and of course mushrooms. Fresh vegetables can be kind of pricey depending on where you are. You might find better luck with frozen or canned vegetables or buying vegetables that are in season. Now, this video has mostly been around protein staples, but I thought I'd show you a couple other charts before I end this video that might be interesting to you. The first one is meat alternatives on a protein percentage basis. Meat alternatives are probably the most hated on vegan food, and while I don't use them much personally, I can't deny the data. There are a lot of really good options that are high in protein. Now, if you don't like processed foods, this probably isn't for you, but if you're low on time and you're just looking for some decent protein options to keep in the freezer, there are a few. Hopefully you've had time to screenshot that, or you can just head to my website where I have the full vegan protein database and you can search by meat alternatives and see all of this information. Either way, moving on to snacks. Just like the meat alternatives table, the vegan snacks table has a lot of processed foods, so if you don't like those, look more towards the bottom of this chart. But there are a lot of really good high protein snack options. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have these every day or at every meal, but they might be good options to keep on hand if you're just trying to hit your protein goal and you want some easy stuff that'll keep you from snacking on lesser protein foods. Sorry, this was a longer video, but I'm hoping that you learned something new, whether that was a new product that you hadn't heard of before, or maybe a new way to use a familiar product. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any ideas for recipes or other content you'd like to see, just shoot me a message.